Margaret Thompson pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway of the Veterans Affairs Hospital, her rubber-soled shoes making soft, squeaking sounds against the polished floor. At 62, she had become almost invisible to the people who walked these corridors every day. Doctors rushed past her without a glance, nurses chatted over her head as if she wasn't there, and visitors stepped around her cart like it was just another piece of hospital equipment. She had worked at this hospital for 15 years, starting just after her husband died in Iraq. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave her health insurance. More importantly, it let her feel close to the military community that had been such a big part of her life when Robert was alive. Every morning, Margaret arrived at 5:30 sharp. She would clock in, grab her supplies, and begin her rounds through the different wings of the hospital. She knew every corner of this building, every stubborn stain on the floors, every window that needed extra attention. The work was hard on her aging knees and back, but she took pride in keeping the hospital spotless for the veterans who came there for care. The patients were different from the staff. Some of the older veterans would nod at her or say good morning. They understood what it meant to serve, even if her service was with a mop and bucket instead of a rifle. But even among the patients, most barely noticed her presence. Margaret had learned to move quietly, efficiently, almost like a ghost. She would clean around people as they talked, never interrupting, never drawing attention to herself. She heard conversations about medical treatments, family problems, and old war stories. Sometimes she wanted to join in to share her own stories about military life, but she knew her place. Her supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind enough but always stressed about budgets and schedules. The hospital administration was constantly looking for ways to cut costs, and the cleaning staff was always under pressure to work faster with fewer people. Margaret understood the business side of things, but it still hurt when she felt treated more like a number than a person. At lunch, she would sit alone in the small break room, eating the sandwich she packed every morning. Sometimes other cleaning staff would join her, but many of them were much younger and didn't have much in common with her. They would talk about their weekend plans or their children, while Margaret would listen politely and think about her empty house. The afternoons were usually quieter. Margaret would focus on the areas that needed deep cleaning, working methodically through her checklist. She took satisfaction in transforming dirty spaces into clean ones, even if no one would notice or thank her for it. It was honest work, and it connected her to something bigger than herself. In the evenings, she would drive home to her small apartment, heat up a simple dinner, and watch the news. She followed military stories closely, feeling proud when she heard about victories and heartbroken when she learned about casualties. Sometimes she would look at the old photos of her and Robert, remembering when she had been part of the military community, not just someone who cleaned up after it. Her neighbors were polite but distant. Most of them were younger, busy with their own lives and families. Margaret had learned to be self-sufficient, to handle problems on her own, to not expect much from other people. She had become good at being invisible, at not needing attention or recognition. But sometimes, late at night, she would wonder if anyone would miss her if she just disappeared one day. Would the hospital hire someone else to push her cart? Would anyone remember that she had worked there for 15 years, that she had never missed a day except when she had pneumonia 3 years ago? These thoughts didn't make her bitter, just sad in a quiet way. She had accepted that this was her life now. She wasn't looking for fame or glory, just a little acknowledgement that she mattered, that her work had value, that she was more than just part of the background. Margaret had no idea that in just a few days, everything would change. She couldn't imagine that her quiet, invisible life was about to be turned upside down by a chance encounter that would reveal truths she had never shared with anyone at the hospital. The next morning, she would clock in as usual, grab her cart, and begin another day of being unseen. But this time, someone very important was coming to visit, someone who would see her in a way that no one else ever had. The hospital buzzed with unusual energy that Tuesday morning. Word had spread quickly through the administrative offices that General Patricia Hayes, a 4-star general from the Pentagon, would be making an unannounced inspection visit. The hospital director, Dr. Williams, was in full panic mode, sending emails and making phone calls to ensure everything would be perfect. Margaret noticed the tension as soon as she arrived for her shift. Supervisors were walking around with clipboards, checking every detail. The floors had been mopped twice already, and the maintenance crew was touching up paint in the main corridors. Everyone was nervous, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who reminded all the cleaning staff to stay out of the way and work extra quietly. General Hayes had built her reputation on surprise visits to military facilities and veteran hospitals. She believed you could only see the real condition of a place when people weren't prepared for inspection. Her visits had resulted in major improvements at dozens of facilities across the country, and sometimes led to people losing their jobs if they weren't doing right by the veterans. Around 10 in the morning, a black SUV pulled up to the main entrance. General Hayes stepped out, wearing her dress uniform with 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders. She was in her mid-50s, tall and imposing, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Her aide, a young captain, struggled to keep up as she strode toward the hospital entrance. Dr. Williams met her at the door, sweating despite the air conditioning. He had prepared a whole presentation about the hospital's achievements and improvements, but General Hayes cut him off immediately. She wasn't interested in prepared speeches or guided tour. She wanted to see the real hospital, the parts that patients experienced every day. Margaret was cleaning the third-floor hallway when she heard the commotion of people approaching. She quickly moved her cart to the side and continued mopping, keeping her eyes down as she had learned to do over the years. A group of people in uniforms and suits walked past, their voices echoing off the walls as they discussed patient care statistics and budget allocations. General Hayes moved through the hospital like a force of nature. She stopped to talk with patients, asking about their care and treatment. She inspected patient rooms, bathrooms, and common areas. She asked tough questions about staffing levels, equipment maintenance, and response times. Dr. Williams and his team followed behind her, taking notes and promising to address every concern she raised. In the psychiatric ward, General Hayes spent extra time talking with veterans struggling with PTSD and depression. She had served in combat herself and understood the invisible wounds that many soldiers carried home. She listened carefully to their stories and complaints, asking detailed questions about their treatment programs and support services. Meanwhile, Margaret continued her work, moving quietly through the areas the inspection team had already visited. She could see the stress on everyone's faces, the way the regular staff members were walking on eggshells, afraid to make any mistakes that might reflect poorly on the hospital. As the afternoon wore on, General Hayes made her way to the rehabilitation wing, where veterans were working to recover from injuries and learn to live with disabilities. This was always the most emotional part of any hospital visit for her. She had seen too many young soldiers come home broken, and she was determined to ensure they received the best possible care. The inspection was going well from Dr. Williams' perspective. General Hayes had found some minor issues, but nothing that would result in a major report or personnel changes. The staff had performed admirably under pressure, and the hospital was operating efficiently. But General Hayes wasn't finished yet. She had learned that the most important insights often came from the people who worked behind the scenes, the ones who saw everything but were rarely asked for their opinions. She wanted to talk to some of the support staff before she left. As they rounded a corner near the rehabilitation wing, she noticed an older woman mopping the floor near the physical therapy room. The woman was working methodically, carefully cleaning around the equipment and furniture. There was something about her posture, the precise way she moved, that caught the general's attention. Margaret sensed someone watching her and looked up briefly. For just a moment, her eyes met those of the tall woman in the military uniform. There was something familiar about the general's bearing, something that stirred old memories in Margaret's mind. General Hayes stopped walking. Something about the cleaning woman's face, the way she held herself, seemed familiar. She studied Margaret for a moment, trying to place where she might have seen her before. Dr. Williams noticed the general had stopped and grew nervous. He hoped there wasn't a problem with the cleanliness of the area. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been following the group at a distance, quickly moved forward to address any concerns about her staff member. But General Hayes wasn't looking at the floor or the walls. She was looking directly at Margaret, her military-trained mind working to piece together fragments of memory. There was something about this woman that didn't fit with her current surroundings, something that suggested a story much different from what appeared on the surface. The moment stretched on as the two women looked at each other across the hallway. Margaret felt exposed under the general's intense gaze, but she couldn't look away. There was recognition in those eyes, though she couldn't understand why a 4-star general would be looking at her like that. Tomorrow would bring answers that no one in that hallway could have anticipated. General Hayes took a step closer to Margaret, her eyes narrowing as she studied the older woman's face more carefully. The hospital corridor seemed to fade away as she searched her memory, trying to place where she had seen those features before. There was something about the shape of Margaret's eyes, the line of her jaw, that triggered a flood of memories from decades past. Margaret felt increasingly uncomfortable under the general's scrutiny. She glanced nervously at Mrs. Rodriguez, who looked just as confused as everyone else about why the inspection had suddenly stopped. Dr. Williams cleared his throat softly, wondering if there was some problem with the cleaning staff that he should address. Then it hit General Hayes like a lightning bolt. The face before her was older, marked by years of hard work and grief, but the essential features were unmistakable. She was looking at Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, one of the finest military police officers she had ever served alongside in Iraq 20 years ago. General Hayes had been a young major then, commanding a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous sectors of Baghdad. Lieutenant Sullivan had been part of the military police unit responsible for base security, convoy escort, and prisoner transport. She had been fearless, dedicated, and absolutely reliable in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Margaret had been born Margaret Sullivan in a small town in Ohio. She had joined the Army right out of high school, looking for adventure and a way to pay for college. She had excelled in military police training and had been assigned to various bases before deploying to Iraq in 2003 as part of the initial invasion force. During that deployment, Lieutenant Sullivan had distinguished herself repeatedly. She had led dangerous missions to transport high-value prisoners, had organized the security for humanitarian aid convoys, and had been wounded twice by roadside bombs but had refused evacuation both times. Her men respected her completely, and her superiors knew they could count on her for any mission, no matter how dangerous. General Hayes remembered one particular incident when Lieutenant Sullivan had saved her life. They had been traveling in a convoy when they came under heavy fire from insurgents. Sullivan had immediately organized the defense, positioning her MPs to return fire while coordinating with air support. When a rocket-propelled grenade had disabled the major's vehicle, Sullivan had personally led the rescue mission to extract her and her staff. But Margaret's military career had come to a tragic end. Her husband, Sergeant Robert Thompson, had been killed by a sniper while on patrol. Margaret had been devastated by the loss, but she had continued to serve with distinction until her tour ended. However, when she returned to the United States, she had been unable to cope with civilian life and her grief. She had struggled with what would later be recognized as PTSD, though at the time there was less understanding and support for such conditions. She had tried to continue her military career, but the memories and trauma had made it impossible. After several difficult months, she had made the painful decision to leave the Army and try to build a new life. General Hayes had lost track of many of her soldiers over the years as their careers had taken them in different directions. She had often wondered what had happened to Lieutenant Sullivan, one of the most promising young officers she had ever commanded. She had assumed that Margaret would have continued to rise through the ranks, perhaps becoming a senior non-commissioned officer or even an officer herself. To find her here working as a janitor was almost incomprehensible. This was a woman who had been awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and numerous commendations for valor. She had been a leader, a warrior, someone who had served her country with honor and distinction. Margaret noticed the change in the general's expression and began to feel a stirring of recognition herself. There was something familiar about this officer, something that brought back memories of dusty Iraqi streets and the camaraderie of soldiers under fire. But it seemed impossible that this important general could be someone from her past. General Hayes stepped forward, her voice gentle but filled with emotion. She spoke Margaret's name, her old rank, and the unit they had served in together. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, bringing back a flood of memories she had tried so hard to forget. The recognition was mutual now. Margaret straightened unconsciously, her civilian posture shifting slightly toward the military bearing she had once carried so naturally. Her eyes filled with tears as she remembered Major Hayes, the officer who had been both demanding and fair, who had trusted her with the most important missions, who had recommended her for medals and promotions. Dr. Williams and the rest of the group watched in confusion as the two women stood facing each other, clearly sharing some kind of profound moment. Mrs. Rodriguez worried that her employee had done something wrong, while the hospital staff wondered what could possibly connect their cleaning lady to a four-star general. General Hayes could see the pain in Margaret's eyes, the weight of years of loss and struggle. She understood immediately what had happened. This was a veteran who had fallen through the cracks, someone who had served with honor but had been failed by the system she had sacrificed so much to protect. In that moment, General Hayes made a decision that would change everything. She raised her right hand to her forehead in a crisp military salute, holding the position with the precision and respect due to a fellow warrior. The gesture was a formal acknowledgement not just of Margaret's past service, but of her enduring worth as a person and a soldier. The hallway fell completely silent as everyone processed what they were witnessing. A four-star general, one of the most powerful people in the military, was saluting a hospital cleaning woman. Margaret's hands trembled as she instinctively returned the salute, her body responding to 20 years of military training, even though her mind could barely process what was happening. The mop fell from her other hand, clattering against the hospital floor as muscle memory took over and she snapped to attention. The silence in the hallway was deafening. Dr. Williams stood frozen, trying to understand how his cleaning lady could possibly know military protocol well enough to return a general's salute with such precision. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened in shock as she watched her quiet, invisible employee transform before her eyes into someone completely different. General Hayes held her salute for the full duration of military protocol before dropping her hand. Her voice was thick with emotion as she spoke. Sergeant First Class Margaret Sullivan Thompson, Bronze Star, Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device, and Combat Action Badge. One of the finest soldiers I ever had the honor to serve alongside. The words echoed through the hallway like thunder. Dr. Williams felt his legs go weak as he processed what the general had just revealed. Mrs. Rodriguez covered her mouth with her hands, understanding for the first time that she had been supervising a decorated war hero for 3 years without knowing it. Margaret's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. For 15 years, she had hidden her military service from her coworkers, afraid that talking about it would bring back the nightmares and panic attacks that had driven her out of the army. She had told everyone that her husband had died in Iraq, but she had never mentioned that she had served there too, that she had been wounded in combat, that she had saved lives and led missions under fire. General Hayes could see the fear in Margaret's eyes, the terror of being exposed after so many years of invisibility. She understood that this woman had been surviving by staying hidden, by not drawing attention to herself or her past. But she also knew that Margaret deserved recognition, deserved to be seen for who she really was. Dr. Williams stepped forward, his voice shaky. "General, I had no idea. Margaret, why didn't you ever tell us you were a veteran? We have special programs, benefits, support services for veterans on our staff." Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want the questions, the looks, the pity. I just wanted to work and be left alone." General Hayes understood completely. She had seen many veterans struggle with the transition back to civilian life, had watched proud soldiers become convinced that their service didn't matter, that they were broken or damaged beyond repair. The system that was supposed to support them often failed them, leaving them to navigate their trauma alone. But as General Hayes looked at Margaret, she didn't see a broken cleaning lady. She saw the same brave woman who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, who had earned the respect of every soldier under her command, who had been recommended for promotion to sergeant major before her husband's death had changed everything. The young captain who was serving as General Hayes' aide stepped forward with a tablet computer. At the general's request, he quickly pulled up Margaret's military service record. The information that appeared on the screen painted a picture of exceptional service and sacrifice. Margaret had served 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She had been wounded 4 times, twice by roadside bombs and twice by small arms fire. She had received the Bronze Star for leading a rescue mission to save wounded soldiers from a burning vehicle. She had been awarded the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster for her multiple combat injuries. Her evaluation reports described her as an exemplary leader and one of the finest soldiers in the unit. But the record also told the story of her decline after her husband's death. There were notes about psychological counseling, about difficulty readjusting to garrison duties, about the medical discharge that had ended her military career just short of retirement eligibility. General Hayes shared some of these details with the group, not to embarrass Margaret, but to ensure that everyone understood the caliber of person they had been working alongside without knowing it. She wanted them to understand that the quiet woman who mopped their floors was a genuine American hero. Word began to spread through the hospital with stunning speed. Nurses, doctors, patients, and other staff members heard about what was happening and came to see for themselves. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered in the hallway, everyone wanting to witness this unprecedented moment. Among the crowd were several veterans who were receiving treatment at the hospital. When they learned about Margaret's service record, many of them stepped forward to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Some were younger veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who understood exactly what she had been through. Others were older veterans from Vietnam who recognized the signs of someone who had been carrying their burden alone for too long. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the attention, but also strangely relieved. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't have to pretend to be someone else. She didn't have to hide her past or downplay her experiences. She could stand as herself, as the soldier she had been and in many ways still was. General Hayes announced that she was personally going to ensure that Margaret received all the veteran benefits and services she was entitled to. She would be connected with proper medical care for her PTSD, with counseling services, and with career assistance if she wanted to pursue other opportunities. But more importantly, General Hayes made sure that everyone understood that Margaret's value as a person wasn't diminished by the work she had been doing. Honest work had dignity, and there was no shame in any job performed with pride and dedication. What mattered was that Margaret was finally being seen for who she truly was. As the crowd began to disperse, General Hayes asked Margaret if they could talk privately. She wanted to hear Margaret's story, to understand what had happened in the years since they had served together, and to see how she could help her fellow warrior find her way to a better place. General Hayes and Margaret sat in Dr. Williams' office. The door closed to give them privacy for what both women knew would be a difficult conversation. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she accepted a cup of coffee, her emotional armor finally stripped away after 15 years of carefully maintained invisibility. For the first time since her husband's death, Margaret told someone the complete story of what had happened to her after leaving the military. She spoke about the nightmares that kept her awake, the flashbacks that would hit her without warning, the crushing guilt she felt about surviving when Robert hadn't. She described how she had tried to work various jobs but couldn't handle the stress and responsibility, how she had gradually retreated from the world, until cleaning seemed like the only work she could manage. General Hayes listened without judgment, understanding better than most how combat trauma could derail even the strongest soldiers. She had seen too many promising careers ended by invisible wounds, too many heroes convinced they were failures because they couldn't seamlessly transition back to civilian life. Margaret explained how she had ended up at the hospital almost by accident. She had been living in a small apartment nearby, struggling to make ends meet on disability payments, when she saw a job posting for cleaning staff. The work was simple and solitary, requiring no decisions that could trigger her anxiety, no leadership responsibilities that reminded her of the missions where good soldiers had died. The irony wasn't lost on either woman that Margaret had spent 15 years invisibly serving veterans without anyone knowing she was one herself. She had taken pride in keeping the hospital clean for people who had shared similar experiences, even if she couldn't bring herself to connect with them directly. General Hayes shared her own struggles with the transition from combat to leadership roles in peacetime. Even as she had risen through the ranks to become one of the highest-ranking women in the military, she had dealt with survivors' guilt and the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of soldiers. She wanted Margaret to understand that struggling didn't make her weak or broken. Over the following weeks, General Hayes kept her promise to help Margaret navigate the Veteran Services System. She personally contacted officials at the Department of Veterans Affairs to ensure that Margaret received proper medical care for her PTSD. She arranged for Margaret to meet with counselors who specialized in combat trauma and helped her apply for benefits she had never known she was entitled to. The hospital administration, led by Dr. Williams, was eager to make amends for how they had overlooked a decorated veteran in their midst. They offered Margaret a position in the Veteran Services Department, helping other veterans navigate the hospital system and access the care they needed. It would use her military experience and her understanding of both the veteran community and the hospital's operations. Margaret was initially hesitant to take on a role that would make her visible again, but the counseling sessions were already helping her process her trauma in healthier ways. She began to realize that her experiences, both positive and difficult, could be valuable in helping other veterans who were struggling with similar challenges. Her first day in her new position was emotional for everyone involved. Many of the staff members who had worked alongside her for years came by to congratulate her and apologize for not seeing her true worth. Some admitted they felt ashamed for treating her as invisible, but Margaret assured them she had worked hard to remain unseen. The veteran patients at the hospital embraced Margaret immediately. They could sense her authenticity, her genuine understanding of what they were going through. She didn't speak to them as someone who had read about military service in textbooks, but as someone who had lived the same experiences, faced the same challenges, and struggled with the same demons. Margaret's story began to spread beyond the hospital. Local news outlets picked up the story of the decorated veteran who had been working unrecognized as a janitor before a general's visit revealed her true identity. Veterans organizations reached out to invite her to speak at events and share her experiences with other veterans who might be struggling in silence. While Margaret appreciated the recognition, she was careful not to let it overwhelm her. She continued her counseling sessions and worked closely with mental health professionals to manage her PTSD symptoms. She learned coping strategies for dealing with anxiety and depression and slowly began to rebuild connections with the world around her. General Hayes stayed in touch, visiting the hospital several times over the following months to check on Margaret's progress. She was proud to see her former soldier finding her way back to a life of purpose and meaning, using her experiences to help others rather than being defined by her wounds. Margaret's apartment began to feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. She started talking to her neighbors, joined a support group for military spouses who had lost their partners, and even began dating a retired veteran she met through the hospital's programs. Most importantly, Margaret learned that being seen didn't mean being vulnerable to additional pain. The recognition she received didn't take away her trauma or magically solve all her problems, but it did give her a sense of purpose and community that she had been missing for 15 years. The hospital created a plaque in the main lobby honoring all veteran employees, with Margaret's name listed first along with her service record and decorations. Every day, patients and visitors could see that the people caring for them understood sacrifice and service from personal experience. Margaret's story became a reminder that heroism doesn't always look like what people expect. Sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly, by people who show up every day to do necessary work without recognition or thanks. Her journey from invisible cleaning lady to recognized veteran advocate proved that it's never too late to reclaim your identity and find new ways to serve. In the end, Margaret realized that she had never really been invisible. She had been seen all along by the patients who nodded good morning, by the fellow veterans who recognized something familiar in her bearing, and by the general who remembered the outstanding soldier she had been. The recognition had always been there, waiting for her to be ready to accept it and step back into the light.